My name is Darren Gerdes, and this is the Daily Brief. I'm looking at the losses from the Defense Ministry of Ukraine. Almost 400,000 Russians killed or wounded. In fact, you're so close. I told you a few days ago that it could be as soon as Sunday where you pass the 400,000 mark. Then yesterday I revised it to, I think it would probably be by Saturday. And now I'm thinking it might even be Friday. And here's the math to that. You have 950 off the battlefield today. If you pass 910 tomorrow, and that's very possible. I mean, it's been 800 to 1,050 over the last 5 days or so. If you pass 910, they'll hit 400,000 Russian killed or wounded. You also want to keep your eyes on things like how many tanks the Russians can put together about 3 tanks a day and put them on the battlefield. And if you take off 9, you're down 2. I mean, that's the math. Here we're down 1 warship yesterday, and we'll talk about that as well. I want you to look at the number of armored combat vehicles off the battlefield and number of tanks off the battlefield, 6 and 12,000 respectively. We'll come back to that at the very end. Okay, let's look at the next. This is the British Ministry of Defense update on 14 February. That's yesterday. Ukrainian forces conducted a successful uncrewed surface vehicle attack on the Russian landing craft Caesar Kunikov. Now, I mentioned yesterday, why were they attacking them? Well, like, why keep going after these landing craft? And one possibility is that they're not nearly as armed as a battleship, but they're explaining it here that it's making the logistical chain vulnerable. Like, if you can't keep using these landing craft, and then when the Kerch Bridge is actually destroyed, particularly, it's going to make it very, very difficult for the Russians to continue to supply Crimea. And that's essentially the end goal, is not just driving out of Donetsk and Luhansk and the other regions that were seized, but to also retake Crimea. Supply to Avdiivka evacuation is complicated, but reserve logistics are being used. What's going on there? So this number that we saw here with the 950, I wouldn't be surprised if it was almost equivalent, maybe even equivalent or more right now, only because of Ukrainian losses. And I know that sounds heretical to be saying, because they're fighting defensive and people don't want to believe that. But right now, the Russians have artillery and are using it in a wildly superior way to what the Ukrainians are able to do. They're using missiles and rockets and all kinds of things there that the Ukrainians simply can't answer back. And that's becoming a terrible problem. Okay, but now they are evacuating, and they're trying to evacuate in an orderly way, and that's going to give Russia a win. They're going to have a political win of, see, we took this town of Avdiivka, which doesn't, I mean, the town itself is not that significant, but it's going to be a win for the Russians. Evacuation is complicated, but a reserve has used a logistics artery that was prepared in advance. So they're going to be able to escape encirclement and capture, but they're paying a price in the process. Anton Gerashenko is talking about, here are destroyed tanks. And this is a Russian talking now. Here are our destroyed tanks. Here's a corpse, half a body, a red ribbon. He is ours. Everything is covered with dead bodies. 30% of the brigade of 4,000 men were left. We haven't eaten or drunk water for days. We have problems with water and food, said a Russian soldier who was assessing the situation of the occupiers near Avdiivka. But again, it's also very, very perilous for the Ukrainians that are there as well. And we can't just gloss over. We can't look at just half the equation, or we'll have a distorted view. It's a very bad situation. And the situation is amplified by the lack of weapons that have been able to be sent to the region. Russia and Ukraine exchange air attacks after the sinking of a Russian warship. Russia and Ukraine exchanged these air attacks on Thursday, with Moscow targeting cities across Ukraine and Kyiv striking the Russian border city of Belgorod. We'll come to that in just a moment. At least 7 people were reported injured after attacks on Kyiv, Lviv, and the city of Zaporizhia. Hours later, Russian authorities said 5 people were killed and 18 injured in a missile strike on the Russian city of Belgorod. And the Russians are, of course, up in arms about how could you dare attack Belgorod. Here's what happened in Lviv. A hit to an infrastructure facility in Lviv was documented. The fire continues, adding 16 residential buildings on this particular street where part of the windows were blown out by the blast. Cars parked nearby were damaged. Okay, so a residential area in Lviv, in the western part, residential buildings. Okay, so here's a little bit more about the Belgorod attack. Switching back over to think about Belgorod, 5 people have been killed in an air attack on the Russian city of Belgorod, says the region's governor. 18 others are said to have been wounded in the strike not far from the Ukrainian border. Russian officials said air defense systems had shot down 14 Ukrainian missiles over the Belgorod region. Don't know what they were doing. I don't know exactly what they were after, but there were hits inside Belgorod like this. And of course, Che Baus, from the RT commentator, the Irish, I think he's Irish, guy that's on RT quite a bit, said Ukrainian terrorists continue to attack Belgorod. No military targets. A shopping center. Remnants of Czech-supplied vampire rockets were visible at the scene. At least 2 children, 3 adults were murdered with these NATO weapons today. Now, I don't know what was in that shopping center. My guess is it's one of 2 things. Either they had identified targets that were there. That's what happened with the bakery not too long ago. Or the missiles were knocked off course or shot down or by the Russians. It's very unlike the Ukrainians to go after civilian infrastructure, but it's not unlike the Russians to do what they did in Lviv. The infrastructure facility in Lviv was documented. The fire continues. 16 residential buildings on this, right? I mean, it's not unlike the Russians, but they complain when it happens to them. So I think you can't have it both ways. And if the Ukrainians were indiscriminately going after a shopping center, I'd be rightly upset about that. That's not okay in spite of this, but I don't think that's what was happening. I think there's more to the story that we just haven't seen just yet. Okay, meeting of Ukraine-Nato Council kicks off in Brussels, and Umerov is there, but he's there via video, and that's unfortunate. It'd be far better if Umerov was there in person. There's just something about an in-person meeting but better to be represented than not be represented. Okay, last couple of stories. Latvia is allowing the confiscation of vehicles with Russian license plates to take force, and this was a law that they created some time ago, a law that authorities to confiscate vehicles with Russian license plates come into force in Latvia on February 15th. Owners were instructed last year that by February 14th they had to either replace the license plates with Latvian ones or remove the vehicles from the Baltic nation. This will be played out in Russian propaganda in RT and TASS and Pravda and Sputnik and things along those lines as a provocation. Now, I saw this as well, and I don't think that this is likely to happen. The Baltic countries are already preparing for the invasion of Russian Federation. Construction of thousands of kilometers of fortifications is currently underway, according to the Times. I don't think this is likely to happen, how that the Russians would invade and take over Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. However, were they to do this, were they to invade, were they to sweep over, there's not a lot that these 3 Baltic nations could actually do to repel the Russians if they were serious about connecting Russia all the way to this little bit of Kaliningrad, Russia, right, and try to, take this whole thing. There's not a lot they could do to repel them. They could take it. You could push them out of it afterwards, but after such great damage and upheaval that it would be just devastating. And these 3 countries understand what's at stake. Okay, now I don't think that that's going to happen, and this is what I was talking about earlier. The Russians are down 6,000 tanks and 12,000 armored combat vehicles. Doesn't mean they couldn't be stupid again, but I think it's highly unlikely. But tell me what you think. Put that in the comments below. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.